World War II was one of the most defining events in human history. It was a time of unimaginable loss, monumental courage, and immense change. The effects of this global conflict still echo through our lives today. But what if the war had ended differently? What if the outcome of this devastating war had been radically altered, changing the world in ways we cannot even begin to imagine? One of the most obvious and chilling possibilities is if Germany had won the war. Imagine a world where Nazi Germany was the dominant power in Europe and possibly the world. If Hitler's forces had been able to crush the Allies and solidify their control over Europe, it would have been the end of democratic governments across the continent. The oppressive Nazi regime would have spread its ideology far and wide. Countries like France, the United Kingdom, and even the United States would have had to reckon with the terrifying power of Nazi Germany. What would the world look like under the thumb of Nazi control? The Germans were already implementing the harshest, most brutal policies in the areas they occupied. Jewish people, Romani people, disabled people, and other minorities were being rounded up and exterminated in concentration camps. If Hitler had gained total control, the number of lives lost could have reached even higher proportions, and the horrors of the Holocaust might have expanded beyond Europe. The sheer scale of violence and cruelty would be unimaginable. If Nazi Germany had won, the United States might have been forced to retreat into isolation. The USA, which fought the Germans fiercely on the Eastern Front, could have become the last stand of anti-Nazi resistance. A cold, terrifying war between the two superpowers could have erupted, plunging the world into a terrifying new global conflict. The post-war world would have been entirely different, with two powerful opposing regimes, one fascist, the other communist, vying for control. This could have created an even more volatile and dangerous period in history than the Cold War, where the threat of nuclear war could have been far more immediate and far more real. The global economy would have looked radically different as well. Nazi Germany had plans to remake Europe into a massive, Nazi-controlled superstate with a focus on exploiting resources and labor from occupied territories. If the Nazis had succeeded, the entire European economy would have been shaped by their authoritarian policies, leading to mass exploitation and deep inequalities. International trade would have been heavily regulated by the Axis powers, with no room for free market economies to flourish. If the war had taken this tragic turn, what would have happened to the United Kingdom, the United States, and other allied powers? The British Empire, already weakened by the war, would have crumbled under the weight of the Nazi forces. The United States, which emerged from the war as a superpower, might have faced a new kind of oppression on its shores. Could the United States have fought against Nazi control, or would they have had to surrender? The Axis powers could have sought to invade America, possibly leading to a massive conflict between the fascist world and the democratic world, one that could have involved the use of even more extreme weapons and strategies. But let's flip the script and think about a different outcome. What if the Allies had managed to win, but in a far more destructive and brutal way? In our reality, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which led to Japan's surrender. But what if the atomic bombs had been used in different ways? Or more extensively, perhaps the United States could have used the atomic bomb on other Axis powers, possibly on European cities under German control. The sheer scale of devastation would have been unimaginable. The world would have been forever scarred by the long-term effects of radiation and the political, social, and economic consequences of widespread destruction would have been felt for decades. Even with the defeat of Nazi Germany, the war's aftermath would have left deep scars on the planet. The Cold War, which defined much of the second half of the 20th century, may have played out differently. With Europe in ruins and a massive power vacuum, the United States and the Soviet Union might have formed an even stronger and more aggressive alliance. Or perhaps the two powers could have gone to war, creating a direct confrontation between two global superpowers. This new, more dangerous Cold War could have sparked more regional conflicts and fueled the creation of even more terrifying weapons. The world might have also experienced an economic depression far deeper and longer than the Great Depression of the 1930s. The economies of Europe, Asia, and even the Americas would have been devastated by the war's destruction. The economies would have taken decades to rebuild, and the road to recovery would have been paved with even more suffering. The labor and resources needed to rebuild entire nations might have caused tensions between countries. The post-war recovery we know today, symbolized by the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Germany and Japan, would have been entirely different. Entire nations might have remained in a state of poverty and chaos for many years. But let's take a step in an even stranger direction. What if the war had ended with a more peaceful resolution? What if there had been an earlier end to the war with fewer lives lost? Could the rise of Nazi Germany have been halted before the full-scale war even began? Perhaps an earlier intervention by the United States or Britain could have stopped Hitler before he gained full control of Europe? If the war had ended with a negotiated peace, it's possible that many of the horrors of the Holocaust and the destruction of cities like London and Berlin would have been avoided. The world might have been left with a different kind of post-war Europe, one where Germany wasn't utterly defeated, but instead worked alongside the Allies in a rebuilt Europe. The post-war recovery might have also been faster and more successful if the war had ended with a negotiated peace. Germany, Italy, and Japan might have been spared the punishment and humiliation that they faced after their defeat. They could have played a more active role in rebuilding Europe and Asia. Nations that were occupied during the war might have regained their independence sooner, and perhaps the United Nations could have played a stronger role in keeping the peace. The Cold War might have been avoided, and international relations could have taken a more cooperative turn. But even in this peaceful outcome, the war's legacy would have been long-lasting. The technological advancements made during the war, particularly in the fields of rocketry, computing, and medicine, would have still shaped the world. However, if the war had ended with fewer destructive consequences, it's possible that these advancements would have been made more gradually and with fewer global repercussions. Think about the cultural shifts that came after the war. World War II was a catalyst for massive changes in art, literature, and music. The rise of the post-war generation, influenced by the horrors of the conflict, shaped new forms of expression and protest. The 1960s, a decade of radical change, could have been delayed or even reshaped by the outcome of the war. The global cultural explosion that took place in the decades following the war might have been different, or perhaps it never would have happened at all. The psychological impact of the war also shaped an entire generation. Soldiers, survivors, and families who lost loved ones had to grapple with the trauma of what they had experienced. The world's collective memory of the war became a driving force in shaping global politics and society. A different outcome, where the war ended earlier or with a negotiated peace, might have led to a world where the trauma of war wasn't as deeply embedded in the global psyche. The social movements that emerged in the 20th century, fighting for civil rights, women's rights, and against nuclear war, might have taken on a different character, shaped by a world that didn't have to deal with the horrors of a devastating global war. In the end, what if World War II had ended differently? The possibilities are endless, and each one brings with it a new set of questions and challenges. From the rise of dictatorships to the spread of ideologies, from the reshaping of international relations to the long-term effects on culture, the outcome of the war would have altered every aspect of the modern world. We can only speculate, but one thing is clear. The war changed the world forever, and the way it ended shaped everything that followed. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.